Hello, everyone. It's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. So, as you know, Wednesday means Wildcard Wednesday here in Instant Deck Tech land, and we have one of the wildest decks I've seen for Modern in a long time to break down today. So, we are checking out Mono Blue Artifact Devotion. So this is like the weirdest mashup of two different decks. It's got some sweet artifact synergies, also kind of just a mono blue devotion deck. This build recently took Kato Kazamusa to an undefeated finish in a Japanese tournament, so congrats to Kato on their finish with the deck. A quick reminder before we break it all down: if you enjoy this deck and you want to see it made into videos, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular gets a shot at being made into videos next week. So, Mono Blue Artifact Devotion starts off like a pretty typical Mono Blue Devotion deck. So you got 3 Cloudfin Raptors. This was a standard all-star in Mono Blue Devotion. Starts off as a 0/1 flyer, but it grows, or evolves I should say, every time you play a bigger creature. So eventually it can be a 1/2, then a 2/3, then a 3/4. So it's kind of a weird build-your-own Delver of Secrets in some ways. And then we have Judge's Familiar and Mausoleum Wanderer. So these are kind of the highlights of the Jeskai Flying Men deck we played not long ago, but they do a couple of really sweet things for this deck. They're 1-mana plays, they disrupt the opponent, they're great against Become Immense, removal spells, Anger of the Gods, stuff like that, so very helpful there. Plus they're just flyers that can get in early damage, and they do something else pretty sweet that we'll talk about as we get to the second part of the deck. So far, fairly typical Mono Blue Devotion stuff. Get those blue mana symbols on the battlefield. That continues with Harbinger of Tides and Kira Greatgrass Spinner. So Harbinger of Tide is, most importantly, a 2-drop with 2 blue mana symbols to power up Devotion. Also can bounce a tap creature back to its opponent's hand. You can play it with Flash if you have enough mana. And then Kira, also 2 more mana symbols that are blue, and it protects all your creatures. Makes it much more difficult to kill your creatures, especially with non-sweepers, and then hopefully the 1-drops, Mausoleum Wanderer, Judge's Familiar, can keep the sweepers covered and make that not an issue. So still, thus far, Mono Blue Devotion, and then of course the payoff for Mono Blue Devotion is Master of Waves. So you get a bunch of blue mana symbols. When you play Master of Waves, you're going to get a whole bunch of elemental tokens. Technically they're 0/1s, but they're getting pumped up by Master of Waves. So you make this huge army. Master has protection from red, so it doesn't die to Anger of the Gods, Lightning Bolts, Lightning Helix, all that stuff, Gut Shot for that matter. But hopefully that's enough to win you the game. Master Waves just goes super wide, you beat down with all these elementals, win the game in a couple of attacks. Thus far, pretty much Mono Blue Devotion. This is what you would expect, a lot of the standard highlights with some modern upgrades. However, things start to take a bit of a twist with Grand Architect. So on one hand, Grand Architect is essentially the pivot card because it works with both of this deck's plans. So we've been talking Mono Blue Devotion. Grand Architect is fine in Mono Blue Devotion. It pumps up all your blue creatures, makes your elemental tokens for Master of the Waves 3/2s, so they're even more threatening, pumps up all your 1-drop flyers. So it's fine in that sense. Also has 2 blue mana symbols, but it has another ability beyond being a blue lord where you can tap an untapped blue creature and add 2 mana to your mana pool that can only be spent on artifacts. And that leads us to our last blue card, Chief Engineer, a 2 mana 1/3 that says artifact spells you have Convoke. So together, these are okay with the Mono Blue Devotion plan, but they allow us to use our blue creatures to cast artifacts. Grand Architect does it very directly. You just make 2 mana by tapping a blue creature. Chief Engineer does it indirectly, but if you have a bunch of 1-drop flyers like we have on the battlefield, theoretically you can tap 3 of those and an artifact is 3 cheaper. You tap 6 of those, you cast a 6-drop artifact for free. So what artifacts are we looking to cast? Well, there's a few. The big ones are Batterskull and Wurmcoil Engine. So these are huge life-linking threats that are really difficult for the opponent to deal with in one way or another. Batterskull can equip to a flyer if we need it to be. If our opponent can deal with the Germ token, we bounce it back to our hand, play it again. So it's very hard to get rid of forever without a naturalized effect, something to just destroy an artifact. And then Wurmcoil Engine is resilient to pretty much all non-path to exile exile removal, because even if your opponent manages to kill this huge 6/6 Death Touch lifelink, you're going to get a couple of worm tokens out of it, and both of these cards gain you a bunch of life, which is great for swinging races. The deck goes further, though. It has a single Mindslaver, and remember, Grand Architect allows you to tap blue creatures to make mana, not just to cast artifacts, but to activate abilities on artifacts. So if we can have 5 blue creatures, which is super reasonable when you consider we have 11 1-drops, we have Master of Waves that can potentially make 5 blue creatures all by itself, we can just tap them, cast and sack the Mindslaver, control our opponent's turn, probably tap them out, swing with all of our stuff, and win the game. And then we have Mir Superion, which takes advantage of both Grand Architect and our Convoke abilities for Artifact. We can tap 1 creature with Grand Architect, or 2 with Chief Engineer, and cast a 5/6 without paying its mana cost. And then we have Phyrexian Metamorph, which might be one of the spiciest things in the deck, because not only can it copy Wurmcoil Engine or Batterskull or something like that, it works with the Mono Blue Devotion plan. We can cast it and make another Grand Architect. We can cast it and make another Master of Waves, make more tokens, pump them up even bigger. So Phyrexian Metamorph is awesome, and it's only 4 mana and it's an artifact, so you can tap 2 blue creatures to cast it. So most of the time it's going to be getting cast for free just by tapping a couple of random creatures you have sitting around. So the deck goes from pretty straightforward Mono Blue Devotion aggro into this craziness of artifacts with Grand Architect and Chief Engineer. It's so sweet. The last main deck non-land card, Sleight of Hand, just help put together your pieces. In the mana base, we get Islands, some Fairy Conclaves, Buried Ruin to get back a Mindslaver, a Wurmcoil, Phyrexian Metamorph, Tech Edge to deal with opponents' lands. In the sideboard, we get some more artifacts, Relic to deal with graveyards. Ubamass is really sweet sideboard tech, as he has some play in Vintage, I believe. Essentially what it does is makes it so control decks can't hold cards in their hand. You gotta read it a couple times. What it actually says is, if a player would draw a card, they instead exile that card, and then each player may play the cards they have exiled with Ubamask, but only for 1 turn. So if your opponent draws a mana leak that they want to hold and wait till you cast something to counter it, that doesn't do them any good because the turn runs out. On the other hand, if you draw a Wurmcoil Engine or a Judge's Familiar, you can just cast it because you're playing at sorcery speed anyway. So it basically punishes decks that are looking to play at instant speed, primarily counters, but also any instant speed stuff. And then another Wurmcoil Engine, Tidebinder Mage, more blue mana symbols, good against Tarmogoyf decks, tap down the Tarmogoyf, Dismember for more removal, Hurkyl's Recall for affinity, Echoing Truth to bounce whatever's troubling you, and Dispel for some protection. And that is Mono Blue Artifact Devotion for Modern, and that's been our instant deck for today. By the way, as you can see at the bottom, only $158 in the paper world, $92 online, so not quite budget Magic cheap, but very cheap for a modern deck. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you soon.